In this video, I will tell you about an invisible phenomenon around which there are many myths and prejudices. You'll learn how people felt about radiation right after its discovery more than 120 years ago, whether it can create mutants, and about radioactive incidents other than Chernobyl, and of course, much more. But first, please subscribe to my channel and like it. It helps my channel grow a lot. It's not hard for you to do this, right? So, 10 interesting facts about radiation. Most people, when the word radiation is mentioned, do not immediately have very good associations. Death from radiation, mutations, the Chernobyl disaster, and so on. Of course, radiation has such a reputation for a reason. However, this has not always been the case. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, people did not know how dangerous this phenomenon was, and treated radiation quite differently. In 1895, the researcher Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. In this case, a year later, other scientists discovered radioactivity. Without waiting for the results of long studies of the new phenomenon, people of that time decided that radiation was the very real source of health, youth, strength, and good humor. Radioactive substances were added to a variety of products, but first things first. Soon after the discovery of X-rays, people realized that they could penetrate the human body, leaving images on a special photographic plate. In this way, as we now know, it is possible to see what condition the bones are in, and whether there are any foreign objects, like shrapnel or bullets, in the human body. X-rays immediately became popular, so they were used in medicine. However, the dangers of the rays were unknown at that time. Therefore, doctors did not protect themselves in any way from them, and often used their hand many times a day as an object for a test shot. That's why, after a few months of active work, doctors' hands would get very red, their skin would peel, they would get skin cancer, and so on. We also had to do amputations sometimes when it went too far. At about the same time, another device was invented, the fluoroscope. It served the same purpose as X-rays, but the image appeared not on a plate, but on a special screen. It was invented by Thomas Edison's company. The device was actively used by military medics in order to quickly enlighten a wounded person and understand what kind of fracture a person had or where a bullet was. In the 1920s, someone came up with the idea of using the fluoroscope in shoe stores. A customer trying on shoes could stick his foot in the fluoroscope and immediately see how the shoe fit on his foot, whether it was compressing the bones or deforming the leaf. However, as you may have guessed, after a while it became clear that the use of such devices was very dangerous. People were getting skin burns and losing their fingers or even their feet. Completely soon, these devices were banned for such use. However, there were thousands of victims. Another important event related to radiation was the discovery of substances called radium and polonium. You may have heard of Marie Curie and her husband, who won the Nobel Prize for this. Radium glowed in the dark, which was a very unusual and incomprehensible phenomenon for humans. The substance fascinated and amazed them, and they wanted to interact with it, until people finally realized that it was dangerous. Perhaps the first victim of radium was Marie Curie herself and her husband. They were unaware of its dangers and often came into contact with it, resulting in skin burns. Maria even developed cataracts. For a while, seeing their health problems, they didn't even think it could have anything to do with radiation. This was only the beginning. Soon, radium would become a material that Europe and the United States would use for the strangest and most unusual purposes. Radium, because of its luminescence and radioactivity, quickly began to spread, thanks to enterprising people who claimed its beneficial properties and complete safety. In the US and Europe, saturated radioactive water began to be sold, just like that, in stores. It was offered to drink for a wide variety of ailments, from eating disorders to impotence, from hair loss to vision problems. It was claimed that radiation is the very life force that people need to be healthy. And it is very easy to get a full supply of this power, just by drinking radioactive water. There were also on sale special ceramic bottles made of material with radium added, so that any water could be poured into it and made radioactive on its own. Radioactive toothpaste, face cream, and various kinds of cosmetics were on sale, with radium. Powders, shadows, blushes, lipsticks, etc. They were advertised as giving a woman's face a pleasant, seductive glow that exuded the radium contained within. Soap with radium, as the producers claimed, removed absolutely all impurities and germs from human skin. Well, people who actively used it all ended up losing their teeth, eyesight, and getting skin burns. But information about the harms of radium didn't spread as fast as it would have in our times. So people continued to use it all and buy it all. There were radioactive pillows and blankets to be irradiated while sleeping. And even condoms with radiums, which the manufacturer claimed were better at preventing pregnancy and disease because of the radium glow in the dark. It was also used, for example, as a paint for watch hands to make them visible in the dark. The case of the so-called radium girls in the factory of a large American company was widely publicized. There was a whole staff of girls whose job it was to paint the dials of watches with radium. It was a well-paid and even prestigious job. The girls were in constant contact with the paint and kept wetting the brushes with their saliva to give them the right shape. The management of the company told the girls that radium was absolutely safe, even though they knew that it was bad for their health. For fun, the girls painted their eyes, teeth, and nails with this paint. As a result, many of the girls became anemic, had broken bones, got burns, and began to die. The doctors hired by the company had long concealed the true causes of their deaths from the public, and even accused the girls of simply having syphilis and not treating it. The girls tried to sue the company, but no lawyers were willing to defend them in court because they had been bribed by the same company. In the end, after many years, the victims still managed to get financial compensation from the company, and the discipline of occupational safety and health began to develop all over the Western world. Employers began to lose lawsuits to their workers more often and pay them compensation for their damaged health. In 1987, a sad story happened in the Brazilian city of Goiânia. There was a hospital that was moving to another building. However, because of litigation with the owner of the old building, the entrance to it was closed. At the same time, the hospital still had a lot of different equipment, including a device for radiotherapy. This device contained a container of the radioactive substance, cesium-137. A policeman was guarding the entrance to the hospital. However, he often left his post for long periods of time, which is what the two looters took advantage of as they broke into the hospital to get hold of metal and various items of value. As you can guess, the criminals stole a piece of radioactive material from the hospital, loaded everything into a truck, and drove home. There, they tried to take the part apart, but at first they were unsuccessful. After the interaction with the object, they both started to feel very bad. Because of this, they went to the hospital. One of the perpetrators even had to have his fingers amputated. However, the doctors did not even think that radiation might be to blame. The criminals did not connect the incident to the piece and continued to pick at it. Eventually, they opened it and found a wonderful glowing blue powder in it. It did not arouse their interest, so they gave the powder capsule to the dump. By the way, later one of the marauders lost his arm because of the radiation. So, after some time, the owner of the dump saw this powder in the capsule. He became very interested and he brought the powder to his house, where he showed it to his family. He also called his friends and acquaintances to see this miracle. People took the powder in their hands. Women wore it on their faces as makeup. Small amounts of the substance were given to various people, who further let their loved ones look at and touch it. Some even added the powder to food and drink because they thought it was magical. And since it was magical, it definitely had to be taken internally. This is how radioactive contamination began to spread in the city of Goiânia. Soon, friends, relatives of the landfill owner, including his wife, began to feel very bad. So, his wife was the first to realize that something was wrong. It had something to do with the powder. She put the rest of it in a plastic bag and took it to the nearest clinic. To the horror of the doctors working there, they immediately reported it to the right place. And the Brazilian government hastily began taking steps to clean up the radiation in the town, which by then had spread very widely. After all, the people who had come into contact with the substance were riding in cars and public transportation, contaminating it all with radiation in the process. As a result, the authorities had to dispose of and bury as many as 3 buses and more than 10 cars. The authorities also had to demolish more than 40 houses contaminated by radiation. More than 100,000 people, upon hearing the news, went to the clinic to see if they were exposed to radiation. But fortunately, no more than 250 people were actually exposed. The fact that those produced in Guyana stopped being bought nationwide because they were feared also hit the town's economy. Tourists stopped going there, and the names of the looters who had caused all these events quickly became known to everyone in the town. As a result, they both became outcasts, all of whom were blamed for the deaths and the gigantic economic losses. One of the looters drank himself to death, The other fell into a depression that caused his health to deteriorate, and in time he too died young. The 6-year-old girl who had ingested the substance and died was buried in the city cemetery in a special fiberglass casket to prevent radiation from spreading in the ground. But on the day of her burial, the cemetery was a mess. Locals protested against the girl's radiation-contaminated corpse being buried in the city cemetery. In all, 6 people died of radiation exposure, but many more suffered lifelong serious health problems after this incident. The international community has imposed much stricter controls on all sources of radiation used in medicine. This is how, because of the ignorance and superstition of ordinary people who thought it was a magic powder, such a terrible tragedy occurred. History knows cases when people became victims of severe radiation exposure in the safest places, for example, in the apartment of an ordinary Soviet apartment building. In the late 1970s, a small capsule containing the radioactive substance cesium-137 was lost at a quarry in the Donetsk region. The capsule was intended for special measuring instruments that were used at the enterprise, which produced crushed stone. Workers at the plant tried to find the capsule, but then stopped looking for it altogether. The capsule ended up in the rubble, which was used to build a multi-story building in Kramatorsk, Ukrainian SSR. The house was finished in 1980, and people, mostly families, moved in. The capsule was buried in one of the walls of the building and emitted radiation, affecting nearby apartments. Eventually, just a year later, a young 18-year-old girl died in one of the apartments, whose health had previously been perfectly fine. Soon, her 16-year-old brother and mother died. Sometime later, another family moved into the apartment, where in 1987 a teenage son died and his little brother became seriously ill. The cause of all the deaths was leukemia. Doctors couldn't figure out what was going on, so they put it down to bad heredity of the deceased. However, the second family, who moved into the apartment, guessed to contact the sanitary and epidemiological station, asking them to measure the level of radiation in the apartment. This was done, and naturally, the radiation background in the apartments was exceeded many times. The tenants of these apartments were evicted, found the wall that was causing the phonation, and cut it out. Then they sent it to the Institute for Nuclear Research, where they removed the capsule. The capsule had a serial number on it, which made it possible to trace where it originally came from. They were able to find those responsible for this terrible accident. They were all employees of the quarry. As a result, they all received small suspended sentences. The cause of the tragedy was declared to be safety violations and the negligence of these employees. In 1999, there was an incident in the small Japanese town of Tokemura. It happened at a plant that was producing nuclear fuel. 3 workers were performing the uranium purification procedure. They were not skilled enough to do this. And in addition, they violated safety procedures and made many mistakes in the performance of this task. As a result, a self-sustaining chain reaction started in the tank that contained the uranium. A huge amount of radiation began to escape. The workers immediately felt severe pain and began to vomit. One of them lost consciousness. All 3 workers received severe radiation exposure. One of them, a man named Hisashi Uchi, received a radiation dose of 17 sieverts, while a dose of 10 is already considered fatal. By some miracle, his body continued to live. They took him to the hospital and tried to save him, but his DNA was completely destroyed. His cells could no longer reproduce themselves, and his immune system was completely out of whack due to the lack of white blood cells in his blood. He was placed in an airtight cell. Every day, he got worse and worse. After a month in the cell, his skin began to peel off. Blood was pouring from everywhere, and he was in severe pain. Despite being injected with morphine, many of his organs failed. Doctors tried to convince his relatives to agree to stop trying to save him and let him die in peace, since he had no chance of survival. However, his family was inadequate. They did not give such consent, and so Uchi was forced to suffer and suffer. There are pictures on the internet of what he looked like after 2 months in the hospital. I can't show these pictures here because it would definitely shock a lot of people. He couldn't even close his eyes because he had no eyelids. He begged to be allowed to die. However, the doctors were obligated to keep him alive in every way they could. His heart stopped many times, but the doctors resuscitated him each time. Once it happened, 3 times in one day. Eventually, his relatives realized what had to be done, and they allowed the doctors to let him die. He suffered for a full 83 days, during which time he was the most radioactive man in history. No one had ever managed to survive such a long time with such a heavy dose of radiation received. Death from radiation exposure is incredibly scary and excruciating. A huge dose of radiation can kill a person at once, or it can condemn him to a long, terrible agony, as was the case with Hisashi Uchi. Did you know that shipwrecks from World Wars I and II are the source of one very valuable and expensive material, steel? This steel is worth much more than what is produced today. It is all about nuclear bombs. The advent of nuclear weapons greatly changed political reality, but it also changed the chemical composition of our planet's atmosphere. On June 16, 1945, the United States tested the world's first nuclear bomb. The explosion sent substances into the atmosphere that had never been there before, namely radioactive isotopes. During the making of steel, these radioactive isotopes now enter the metal from the air, causing the radiation background of such steel to increase. This radiation is minimal and poses no threat to humans. However, this steel is not suitable for certain highly sensitive devices, such as those that detect radiation levels in the human body, or for space-based sensors. Such instruments require steel with the lowest background radiation. So in order to manufacture such electronics, steel is extracted from ships sunk during the war. It's a whole industry. That is why ships sunk at shallow depths are rather quickly removed by divers. In addition to steel, lead is also extracted from the wreckage for the same reasons. It is worth adding that there are ways to produce radiation-free steel even now. However, this requires the use of purified air. Therefore, the production process becomes much more expensive. If you like computer games, you've probably played Stalker or Fallout, or at least you know what they're about. In these games, there are various mutant monsters that appeared as a result of radiation exposure. Various mutated animals with 2 heads, huge green men, giants, and so on. But can this really be the case? Can radiation change ordinary people and animals that much and turn them into real monsters? The short answer to this question is no, it can't. Fortunately, after the Chernobyl accident, there was a huge amount of contaminated radiation around. The area was irradiated by insects, mammals, fish, and plants. Scientists have monitored the flora and fauna of the Chernobyl exclusion zone for decades, and no mutants with 2 heads were found there. Maximum, that was. It was unusual colors of feathers in birds, as well as altered forms of leaves and trees. The fact is that the more complex an organism, the more sensitive it is to radiation, and radiation is more likely to kill it than to cause mutations in it. Viruses, bacteria, and plants are the least sensitive to radiation, followed by insects. All of these creatures tolerate radiation quite well. Birds come next, followed by mammals. Mammals, humans in particular, are very sensitive to radiation. Radiation can really affect the development of the fetus in the womb. A cub may be born with 2 heads or 5 legs, but it will die immediately after birth, or perhaps even be born dead. This is how natural selection works. Researchers did find such cubs in the first 5 years after the disaster. However, they have now stopped being born because of radiation in the exclusion zone. Radiation can damage the health of animals and insects. They can get cancer more often, die more quickly, or lose the ability to reproduce at all. But fortunately, radiation does not produce terrible mutants and monsters. Moreover, animals feel fine in the exclusion zone now, thanks to the fact that there are virtually no humans to disturb their lives. Unfortunately, humans are a far greater threat to wildlife than even radiation. Radiation, of course, can appear to most people as something horrible and very dangerous, but it has many applications that benefit mankind. I will tell you about them in a moment. Radiation is used to irradiate food to kill harmful microorganisms in it and increase its shelf life. Also, treating foods with radiation sterilizes any insects on these foods, which means it makes them unable to reproduce and therefore prevents them from spreading to the countries where these foods are brought in. Irradiated foods are perfectly safe for people, since such food does not have time to become radioactive. During the short process, radiation is also used to test welding seams. When metal parts are joined by welding, special radiation-emitting devices scan the seams, essentially taking X-rays to make sure there are no cracks. Because of this, people can build tall buildings out of steel and concrete with radiation. Smoke detectors also work. They contain a small amount of radioactive substance in them so that the system can work. Radiation is used to accelerate mutations in plants in order to achieve certain changes and to select for reproduction in those plants that have the necessary characteristics. It is also safe for the consumer. You can call this method simply an acceleration for seed selection. But the most important and useful application of nuclear technology is, of course, energy. Nuclear power plants produce large amounts of electricity without polluting the environment with greenhouse gas emissions. However, the reputation of nuclear power plants, of course, leaves much to be desired. According to various surveys, more than half of the residents of the USA and Europe consider nuclear power plants to be dangerous and oppose their construction in their regions. One can understand people. The Chernobyl accident was a real disaster. There have been smaller incidents, such as Fukushima in Japan. But how grounded are these fears? One is now increasingly likely to hear scientists argue that the development of nuclear power and the construction of new nuclear power plants are precisely what is needed to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions into the environment, in combination with renewable sources of energy, of course. According to studies, nuclear power plants have caused far fewer deaths than coal-fired power plants. Let me explain now. Whenever there is an accident at a nuclear power plant, the worst happens pretty quickly. People die and are exposed to radiation. However, there are not many of these victims. At the same time, coal-fired power plants quietly release huge amounts of carbon dioxide and many other things into the atmosphere. All of this causes serious illness in a large number of people who live in this region, and people become victims of these coal-fired power plants, dying of various illnesses. However, such deaths do not get much coverage or media attention. It can be compared to the fact that when an airplane falls, it gets everyone's attention. There are more and more people who are afraid to fly planes. However, no one ever talks about the fact that more people are killed in accidents in just one day in the world than in all the plane crashes of the last few years. Also, with nuclear power plants, it is worth adding that today's new nuclear reactors are much more reliable and safe. Modern reactor designs make a Chernobyl scenario simply impossible. Many people talk about the dangers of nuclear waste from spent fuel. However, this waste is stored at great depths in areas of the Earth where there are no earthquakes. Therefore, there is no danger that this spent fuel could somehow get into the environment. But nuclear power plants do have big ones. There are two of them. The first one is that nuclear power plants run on fuel that has limited reserves on Earth. Right now, there is still plenty of it. But if there are more of these plants, we could run out of fuel by the end of the 21st century. The second problem is the price of such power plants. The average price of building a plant with average capacity is about $15 billion. Therefore, nuclear power should ideally be paired with renewable energy sources, such as wind turbines and solar panels. These two technologies should complement each other because the whole and the sun are not always available, and nuclear power plants provide energy when it is needed. If you like the videos, be sure to write a comment. I read them, and they help a lot in promoting my videos. And as a continuation of the topic, I suggest you watch my releases about scary science experiments. The links will be in the description. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.